starting this video with a bit of an apology. In my last one I said that I'd come up with an origin story for Jenny Greenteeth, and that's not quite true. In this book you will find a pretty much identical story, so I didn't really come up with it myself. It's more I've sort of come up with my own version of it. So Dan, Amy, or even Des, if you see this video or the previous one, very sorry, didn't mean to take anything from you. Everybody else, the book here is English Folk Tales. It's a really good collection of stories. I don't think you can get it in print in the UK at the moment, not brand new anyway, but certainly see if it's available in any second-hand bookshops or anything like that. It is a really good collection. Okay, now then, when this video goes out it will be Friday, and it's also my mum's birthday, and I was hoping that the lockdown would be over by now. It'll be her first birthday that she's not with me dad, so we'll be able to get all the family together instead. Sadly that isn't to be. Hopefully we'll be able to get something sorted out, but not quite the celebration that we wanted. We'll wait until after all this is over for that. But even before this, certainly for me, Friday was very much a family night. I'd go around, I'd see my mum and dad, we'd have our tea together, sometimes a Chinese takeaway, sometimes not. My niece and nephew would be there, more often just my nephew, but would be, very much be all of us together. And one of the challenges I would often be set was to, certainly by my niece and nephew, was to make up a story. Not something I always managed, I have to admit. But sometimes I did manage to pull something out of thin air, which went down well. Anyway, those of you who are lucky enough to be with your families during this time, I know it's going to be getting difficult, and you might be getting sick of each other, but you're certainly very, very lucky to all be together, I think. And I hope you all gather round and enjoy the last story this week. This is one that I pulled out of thin air for my niece and nephew, so I will leave you all with the Werewolf Princess, and see you next week. There was to be a wedding, and great rejoicement was throughout the land, although the princess herself wasn't so sure. She had met the prince a few times, and he certainly seemed very nice, but did she even love him? And was she even ready to get married? With this in mind, she begged her attendants that she might go for a walk to clear her head. Just spend some time by herself for a while. Well, the attendants weren't sure about this. They didn't really like her being by herself, but she was so insistent and made so many promises that so long as she stayed within the palace gardens and the palace grounds, she could go for a walk. So the princess went out to clear her head, get some fresh air, and as she walked, she thought, oh, the prince was a nice man. It would strengthen the land and their kingdoms if she was to marry him. Was anyone really ever ready to get married? With this in mind, she turned to head back to the palace, but in her wanderings, in her thinking, despite her promise, she had unknowingly strayed out of the palace grounds, out of the gardens, and into the surrounding woods. She was quite lost. She didn't know which way she had come, she didn't know which way to go. And so in the hope that it was the right way, she made her way through the trees. Darkness began to fall. Princess was very, very lost, and she couldn't see where she was going, and she stumbled and tripped until she came to a clearing. But to her horror, on the other side of the clearing, staring at her, was a great silver wolf. The princess thought to run, but surely this creature would hunt her down. The wolf stared back at the princess. To her surprise, bowed its head. "Do not be afraid, princess, for I can lead you back to the palace. Follow me." Well, despite her astonishment, the princess realised she had little choice but to follow this wolf that could talk. And so they made their way through the trees, the princess keeping a safe distance, yawning and stumbling. The wolf turned and looked at her. "Princess, we shall not make the palace tonight. Rest a while. I shall lead you there in the morning." So the princess lay down on the forest floor. To her horror, the great silver wolf gently lay over her. She would not sleep tonight. But as she lay there, her fear slowly subsided. The warmth from the wolf and her own exhaustion lulled her into a deep sleep. When she woke, just before the dawn, she looked down at the great sleeping silver wolf. So peaceful, almost kind. She wondered how she could ever be so afraid. She reached out to stroke its soft silver fur. Just as the sun was rising, the wolf's eyes snapped open and it lunged at her. Ow! It was more a nip than a bite, but the princess was startled, afraid. There was no blood, it had barely broken the skin. She looked down at the wolf and she had leapt to her feet. Why? Why did you... The wolf looked at her sadly. The first rays of sun broke through the trees, illuminating the wolf. It evaporated into dust before the princess's very eyes. Confused and bewildered, the princess made her way through the trees, hoping it was the direction the wolf had been leading her. It wasn't long before she heard the cries of a search party sent out to look for her. She called back. Whew! They were so relieved to find her. And although they scolded her, they listened with awe to the princess's tale of the talking great silver wolf and examined her wound and exchanged slightly worried glances. But back at the palace, they bathed and fed the princess and sent her to her room. Now, shortly after nightfall, some very strange noises came from the princess's chambers. Worried, the palace servants opened the door and, to their shock, there, the princess's nightgown in tatters around it, was a great golden wolf. Before any of them could move, the wolf dashed through the door of the princess's chambers, down the stairs, through the kitchen. The kitchen door had been left open, and the wolf ran out into the night. A short time later, the prince arrived, expecting the next day to marry his betrothed. but it was not good news that awaited him. Upon hearing the story, he resolved that very night, to go out into the woods, find the wolf, bring it to justice. The palace attendants suggested that maybe after such a long ride it would be better if he waited, if he ate and if he rested. As angry as the prince was, he saw wisdom in their words, and so he would wait until the next night before he went out. And so it was, as the moon rose on the following night, the prince strode out into the forest to find the great golden wolf. Now meanwhile, the princess herself was very confused. That morning she had woken in the middle of the forest, her nightgown torn about her, her feet bare. No memory of how she had got there. She remembered the search party, going back to the palace, being bathed, fed, sent to bed, and while she'd been combing her hair, she had suddenly felt very faint and fallen to the floor, and then nothing except waking up here in the forest. She began to try and make her way through the trees, but barefooted, her feet soon became sore and cut. She stumbled and tripped, no idea which way to go. But as it became dark, a new energy filled her. Her vision became crisp and clear, her sense of smell sharper. She could hear everything around her. She knew the way to go. So it was she began to run through the forest until she came to the end of a clearing, and to her joy there at the far side was the prince, her beloved. Since leaving the palace, the prince had made quickly through the forest till he had come to the edge of a clearing, and there, to his luck, the other end of the clearing, coming straight towards him, the princess's nightgown still around it, was the golden wolf. He gave out a cry of delight, drew his sword and leapt towards the wolf. Well, at this point the princess was even more confused. Why was she being attacked? The prince swung at her with his sword. Terrified, she turned and ran back into the trees. The prince gave chase, hacking and slashing at her, the great golden wolf that ran ahead of him. It would turn and look at him from time to time with great sorrowful eyes. He felt no mercy for it. Instead, he swung at it again and again, but it always leapt just out of his reach. He chased the wolf deep into the forest through the night. Eventually, as the sun began to rise, the wolf turned to him. They were both exhausted. He did not think it could move much further. With the last of his strength, he raised his sword, and as the sun rose behind him, he was about to strike when fur gave way to flesh. Great paws gave way to long, delicate fingers. And the princess stood before him as the prince dropped his sword and realised to dismay what had happened. The princess fell exhausted, sobbing into his arms. He resolved that the two of them would make it back to the palace. They would find a cure for this terrible curse. They would be together. They began to make their way back through the trees, the prince tracking the way they had come as best he could through where they had trampled their way through the forest at the night, where he had nicked and slashed at the undergrowth with his sword. princess was exhausted. Her feet were soon cut and swollen. The prince picked her up and carried her for a while, but his strength was not infinite. And soon the two of them were both stumbling and staggering through the trees. The sun seemed to race overhead towards the horizon. And as darkness fell, the princess fell again. The prince turned away, unable to watch as the transformation came over his beloved again. When he turned and looked down at the great gold wolf, he saw that it still had the princess's eyes. It looked up at him. It still spoke with her voice. "Don't worry. I can lead us through the palace. I know the way." So it was, the prince followed his princess in wolfen form through the trees. Oh, but he was so tired. He began to stumble and trip. And the wolf turned and looked at him. "We will not make the palace tonight. Rest a while, and I shall keep you safe." So exhausted, the prince fell to the ground and was soon fast asleep. The golden wolf went over, licked his face, and lay across him to keep him safe and warm through the dark. When the prince woke, just before the dawn, looked down at the great gold wolf, he saw there was still beauty in its form. He reached out a hand to stroke it, just as the sun was rising, just as the first rays filled the sky, just as he was about to stroke its fur, the wolf's eyes snapped open and lunged forward and bit his hand. It was more of a nip, really. The bite had barely broken the skin. There was very little blood, but he jumped to his feet and looked down at the wolf, and as the sun performed the transformation, as the wolf turned into the princess, he looked at her and asked why. Why had she done this? The princess had no explanation. He'd frightened her. She'd woken up and seen him reaching down. She'd be confused, and she begged forgiveness, but surely they would make the palace that day. She could remember the direction that they were heading in. So the two of them made their way through the trees, listening out for a search party, hoping to see the palace towers above the tree line. But as far as they walked, as many paths as they took, nothing looked familiar. Again, the sun raced overhead. As darkness filled the sky, the two of them felt a new energy in their bones. New life surged through them. The night became crisp and alive around them. You could hear so much. They had no sense of smell. Their noses so sensitive to everything around them, and they knew which way to go. So the two of them made their way quickly through the woods till they came to the very edge of the forest, where the untamed trees gave way to the well-kept gardens of the palace. And there the great castle stood in front of them. Candles still burning in some windows, but flags of black mourning fluttered in the night sky. The prince and princess looked at each other. They did not wish to return there. They did not wish to go any further. They turned and looked back into the forest, and they realised within themselves they already were home. So they turned and went back into the trees. It is said that somewhere an empty palace stands, surrounded by a great forest. and it is said that living in this forest are men who walk like wolves at night, and that they are ruled over by a prince and his werewolf princess.